Hi, everybody. This is my lunch and learn on trauma-informed leadership with a focus on psychological safety. This is just being done for all of you who can't be there for the actual lunch and learn. So I'm just recording it as I'm just recording it the night before so that you guys can actually still see what it's about. So just to introduce myself a little bit first. So my name is Tanya Hallett, which you already know. I have been a teacher and working in education for the last over 20 years. And I've spent a lot of time working in the hard to staff schools. So kids with a lot of trauma, adolescents and adults all with a lot of trauma. And during that time, I've become really passionate about trauma-informed practice and how that works in working and getting the best that you can out of people. So trauma-informed practice is basically, you'll see the 5 pillars that we work off, but it works off safety, collaboration, choice, trust, and empowerment. And essentially, it's working with people in an empathetic and compassionate way so that everybody achieves the best version of themselves that they can be. But it's being done through a very empathetic and compassionate lens. And the reason that I even started my whole company was a couple of reasons. And one of them was that after working with so many adolescents and adults through my journey in education, and I also worked overseas as well, and spending a lot of time doing that, I realized that trauma is way more common than people think. And just because someone goes into the workforce does not mean that trauma that they have had as a child doesn't exist anymore. It also doesn't mean that through your adult life, any traumatic experiences that you come across, that doesn't go away. So that's the reason I started my company. That's the reason I'm super passionate about this. I have seen how it works with people. I have seen the relationships you build with people. I have seen the success that you get out of people when you use a trauma-informed lens. And it basically just takes a little bit of getting used to, because you've got to reframe how you think about things and you reframe how you see things and understand things. And that's what this is about. So there's a lot of different contexts for trauma informed practice, but this particular lunch and learn is all about trauma informed leadership and safety. I will also say that I do have lived experience of PTSD. I do have lived experience of other various traumas as well, and anxiety and depression. So when I talk about a lot of these things, this is coming from my own personal experience as well as the experience that I've gained from other people that are around me. So let's get started. And we're going to look trauma-informed leadership and safety. I'm sharing my PowerPoint with you. I hope this works. So let's see how we go. First of all, I just want to acknowledge, I would just want to do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are learning on today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and the future leaders that are among us. And I'd like to acknowledge that the past traumas which have affected the traditional owners of this land. And I'd like to acknowledge the intergenerational trauma that has come up as a result of that. And part of what I want to do is pledge to create a better future for the emerging leaders through trauma-informed education. Now, obviously, we are talking a little bit about trauma. What comes up in this should not be too triggering because we're learning sort of around trauma, but in case it does, I just want to share this screen with you. If anything in this presentation does trigger you, please reach out to Lifeline, Beyond Blue, 1-800-RESPECT, or reach out to your EAP, which most workplaces do have. If you are struggling, if something in this presentation has upset you and you feel that you'd like to chat to me, please reach out after the presentation. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. Okay, so normally I would do an icebreaker here, but being that I'm recording this and you guys are on your own, I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to look a little bit at the learning objectives. So we're going to look quickly at why, and I won't spend too long on this, why employees leave, what the difference is between psychosocial risk and psychological safety, what trauma-informed leadership actually is, why you should care about being trauma-informed as a leader, what are the benefits to your organization if you're a trauma-informed leader, the 5 principles of trauma-informed care, and how you can build psychological safety and well-being in your team. Now, that's a lot of learning objectives. I'm going to cover them as best as I can. You're not going to get as much of an in-depth view as you normally would if this was a full day course, because this would be a full day course. But in the interest of saving time, we're just going to have a bit of a look at it. This statistic was really interesting. I saw this come up a while ago. And so in January 2023, Forbes published an article saying that 69% of people said that their managers had the greatest impact on their mental health. It's more than their, more than their doctor, more than their therapist. It has the same impact as their partner does. So if you're spending a huge amount of time with a manager that is, that is not making you feel like you can be the best version of yourself, that is making you feel under pressure, that is making you feel scared of making mistakes, that is making you feel, bullied and harassed, you can imagine the mental impact that that has on people and the damage that does to people's well-being. There's lots of articles around at the moment, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, about bullying in the workplace and how that has really had significant impact on people's mental health, because they're essentially stuck in a severely abusive relationship that they feel they can't leave. And it's really important that we look at this. And the reason that employees are leaving, the most common reason is mediocre management, right? Yes, there's people wanting more money or a fresh start or career progression, and all of those things are also reasons that people leave. But the biggest thing was poor management and being in a negative environment because of the impact that has on people's mental health. And I'm sure you're aware of this. Today's employees want a lot more from their workplace than they may have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You've got the people that are coming into the workplace, so the new generation coming in, are a lot more versed on mental health. They're a lot more well-versed on understanding work-life balance. They're a lot more well-versed on bullying, on poor relationships, and they will not stand for things that people probably did in the past. So that's really changed. I saw this, it's like, we've seen lots of these things about leadership, but I like this because I heard this once when I was doing my mental health first aid instructor course. One of the guys there said that leadership is not a title that's given to you, it's something that you earn through your actions. And it absolutely is something that you learn through your actions, especially when you're looking at people who are from traumatic backgrounds, especially if they're coming from complex trauma backgrounds, which 30% of Australians do. They need to see the actions behind your leadership. Your words don't mean anything. It's the actions, it's what you do. And the way you communicate with that person, the way you show empathy and the way you build trust, that's what's keeping people in jobs, and that's what's keeping those relationships going. And they're very important. I think if we boil it down, employees need 3 things from you as a leader. This is what your team needs. Your team needs to know that you care about them. Your team needs to know you trust them, and your team needs to know that you believe in them. And those 3 things are wicked simple. But I can say they're simple. But there are strategies that you can use, practical strategies to actually display these 3 things, which I will touch on a little bit today. But they're the 3 things. You care about them, you trust them, you believe in them. If you can give people those 3 things, there is not much that you can't achieve with that person. And if you can get a team to think that whole way, there would not be much that you could not achieve with that team. So quickly, to look at psychological safety, because this does get thrown around a lot and people are quite confused about this. So psychological safety is how safe people feel within themselves, within their mental health space, about in work, in the workplace. So can they express themselves? Can they take risks? Can they ask questions? Do they feel safe enough to speak up? Do they feel safe enough to come to their leader and have a discussion with them? Do they feel valued? Do they feel respected? It's safety that has to be created. And I think somewhere along the way, this memo got lost about how people do need to feel safe. Any team needs to feel safe wherever they are. If you go into a classroom, for example, if you have not established safety in that room with those 30 students, you can forget anything happening. You can forget any goals being achieved. You can forget anyone being the best version of themselves because they don't feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they won't speak up. If they don't feel safe, they won't take risks. They won't be creative. They won't be innovative. There's all these things that we need from our teams, and we have to give them psychological safety in order to do that. So they need to know you've got their back. They need to know that if they speak up, they're not going to be bullied. They're not going to be discriminated against. If they say something, you're going to be empathetic about how you listen to it. If they come to you with a problem, they need to know that you're going to deal with it appropriately. You're not going to fob them off and invalidate them. It is so important to have psychological safety. If you've got psychological safety, psychosocial risk will be diminished, because psychosocial risk are things like excessive workloads, time pressure, conflict, role ambiguity, insecurity, work-life balance. The reason that psychological safety, if you can achieve that, you can minimize significantly psychosocial risk, because people will talk to you about any problems that they've got. And people can come to you and say, okay, look, I'm really struggling with this particular project, for example, is taking a heck of a lot more time than what was allocated to it. We need more team members on it. Or they feel that they can come to you and say, okay, look, I'm experiencing a conflict with my team. I'm coming to you for help so that we can talk about it and try and fix it. So if you've got the psychological safety, people can speak up when there's a problem. And that's going to diminish your psychosocial risk. Like, they're basically hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Like, you could put mental health and wellbeing programs in place, and you could send everybody off to do mental health first aid, which, it's not a bad thing to do. It's just that if you're the leader of the team and people can't come to you to express what their problems might be or what the issues are, you're not even going to be able to see what the psychosocial risk is half the time. So they're very much holding hands. Yeah. So if you create psychological safety, you're going to significantly minimize psychosocial risks. Why is it beneficial to organizations? And how does this link to trauma-informed leadership? Well, they actually all go together. That's how. So let's have a look. If you have a competent trauma-informed leader, these are the things that your organization or your team is able to achieve. So your employee well-being is enhanced. The big thing is, and this is the interesting thing, like, a lot of places are talking about, why have we got such a decrease in productivity, and what's happening with this, and why aren't people, why have we got this drop in productivity? What's going on? And the thing is, if people are not feeling safe and supported at work, their productivity drops because they're consistently living in a state of threat, which I'll go into in more detail soon. But all of that impacts their performance. It impacts all of those other things that you need when you need people to be innovative, when you need people to collaborate, when you need people to communicate. If you've got trauma-informed leadership, you will get all of these other things to come within your team. This is the stuff that actually creates a strong team. And it all basically comes down to good communication, empathetic communication, and you're coming from a place of compassion and understanding. If you do that, you're going to get all of these other benefits. So I always say to people, when you're doing trauma-informed practice with anything, you're making an investment that pays huge dividends in the future. In the beginning, you might not think that you might think it's a huge amount of work, but what happens is when you switch your mindset to being a trauma-informed leader, it becomes second nature, and you just wouldn't do anything any other way. It no longer becomes work for you because you've changed your mindset, and then everybody else around you does much better. They're happier, you're happier, everyone's happier, team works better. So trauma-informed leadership, this is what it actually is. So it's an approach that emphasizes understanding, recognizing, and responding to the impact of trauma on individuals and organizations. Trauma-informed leaders prioritize the well-being of individuals first, they foster a culture of empathy, trust, compassion, and collaboration. Trauma-informed is all about person first. So you are looking after the individual, you are looking after the well-being and the health of the individual, you're putting all of that first, and you are considering how is the best way that I can make this person be the best version of themselves? How can I bring out the best in this person? Trauma-informed leadership is a lot about trying to serve your team. And how can you be the best leader for your team? How do you bring out the best in these people? And here are the 5 principles that we do need to know. Your safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Now, like I said, this would normally be a full day to actually look at each of these things. We're going to look at safety today, and I will get through as much of that as I can. But there's also trust, which is where you're building, you're building trust with your team, and that's being transparent about procedures, that's being upfront about changes, conflicts that might be arising, and actually coming to the table and opening up a bit about who you are as a person. It's like we forget that. If you're building trust, the only way to trust someone is to trust. There's no real formula for it. You've got to start by trusting. And to build trust, you've got to give it to get it. And people forget that, because especially if you've got people who, again, who've come from traumatic backgrounds, and especially if it's complex trauma, they have huge problems with building trust with people. You've got to give it first. You've got to show them you trust them to get them to trust you. And that can be hard because it can feel like it's not the right way around for us. But the only way to build this, you've got to give to get. You've really got to give to get. Choice is important because people who've experienced trauma, often you'll find when you talk to them about the point of their life where they had an experience which they found traumatic was the point where they lost control. Choice is incredibly important because it brings power back to people, and it makes people feel empowered, and it makes people feel like they've got some control. It could be a choice between this and this, but it's still a choice. So anyone who's ever had to give choice to a child, or I have to do it to teenagers quite frequently, and I might say, okay, right, we've got a problem in this classroom currently. There are 2 options you've got. You can sit out here and stay here for the rest of the lesson, or you can take a few deep breaths, try and regulate, come back in and focus on the lesson. Choice is yours. I can't force you, but you make the choice. Things like that are really important. It's giving people, it might be an option between 2 things. It could be giving them the choice between what type of training they want to do, the choice of what lunch they want to have. It doesn't matter, but you're still providing choice. Collaboration, obviously, is everybody coming together. That's removing that hierarchical structure of power and encouraging everybody to see themselves all on the same level. And if you do that, you're allowing people that chance to collaborate, because everybody feels like maybe, just maybe, they've got something that's worth offering, and maybe people will listen. And empowerment, and that's where that's the magic. That's the magic. When you do trauma-informed practice, this is the magic, right? The empowerment is when all these other things that you've built means that this individual starts to realize that they have strengths. They have got all these great things that they can offer, and they can be great, and they can, they do have something worth saying. Doesn't matter what background they're from. It doesn't matter their race. It doesn't matter their ethnicity. It doesn't matter their background. They still have things to offer, and that's where the true magic happens. And I've seen this happen when people start to realize what their potential is, and that's true magic. And that's what you want your team to get to. You want them to be empowered. You want them to realize the potential that they've got. And all the way, they've got you supporting them. All the way, they've got you going, yep, you're building them up. Okay. The other thing I will say about implementing trauma-informed practice is it's never about perfection. You're not going to get this perfect every time. That's okay. You're going to make mistakes along the way. That's okay too. Right? We need to acknowledge that we all make mistakes, that we're not perfect humans. But if people see you putting in the effort and they see you trying, that's all that most people are looking for. They're actually not looking at you to be perfect. They're looking to see that you're trying. And if you deal with a particular situation, you think, wow, that didn't go very well. That's okay. Just stop, reflect, and think about what you can do better next time. Never underestimate the power of an apology. People who are in positions of leadership often forget that who doesn't like need an apology from time to time. If you've made a mistake, own the mistake. People aren't going to be annoyed with you for owning the mistake. They're going to be annoyed with you for pretending it never happened. I'm sorry, I didn't do that really well. I was having a bad day myself. I apologize. What can we do better next time? And don't ever underestimate saying that the power that there is in saying to someone, I care about you. I want to help you. I want to see you reach the best version of yourself that you can be. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. I was just going to say here as well that, people who've probably seen the trauma iceberg, there's lots of different versions, but I thought this was a really good work one because up here you've got all your results, your actions, your activities, your plans, your blah, 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 blah. All of this is what's on the surface of when we're at work, in the workplace. These are all the things that we see. And these things are all of the things that are underlying that. And the problem is that you don't always have insight into how someone's feeling, into what their background was, into their needs and fears, into what their identity is, or what is important to them, or what things they feel are really important to their identity. What are their perceptions? What are their projections? How do they really see a situation? We don't know all of that. And people put a list of a whole line of defenses here because they need to protect this part of themselves, because they don't always feel that they can show you this part. With trauma-informed leadership over time, people will show you this part. So they'll show you these things about themselves. And then you've got a real true collaboration between two people, and you've got that real connection. But you have to build that trust and choice and safety so that people know they can lower their defenses to show you a bit more about what's important to them. And again, it helps create psychological safety. And I do love this. A great leader creates more leaders. In fact, like with most leadership, your whole purpose with leadership is you're trying to make that person be the best version of themselves. And that person might be a fantastic leader. They might have the capability of being an excellent leader. And if that person has that capability, we should absolutely be nurturing that. And we need to see all people as potential leaders, because they could be, if they're given the right steps to get there and the right mentoring and the right nurturing. So let's look at some practical suggestions of how we actually make all of this happen as a leader. You can tell I'm super passionate about this, about this subject. And you need to know practically how do you make it happen. So you have to use particular strategies. We're going to look at a couple that you can use for safety. So I've actually built a 7-step process for showing how you build safety within a team. I'm hoping to get to all 7, but I may not be able to. I also don't think you're going to want me talking to you for longer than an hour, so we'll probably get up to 5. The first one is educate yourself and your team about trauma. You also need to build self-awareness of stress and trauma within yourself and your team. You need to shift your thinking. This is a big one. You shift your thinking from you shift your thinking from judgment to curiosity. So when something happens, you consider why it happens, what's underneath this particular thing that you're seeing. In my experience, and I'll swear by it, no one ever does anything without a reason. No one ever behaves anyway, or does anything or says anything or comes across a particular way without a reason. Your job is to figure out what the reason is, or to try and figure out what the reason is. And that's not always easy. Modeling and encouraging empathetic communication in crisis. This is a really big one, and it's something that it's quite a skill that can be quite difficult to learn and to practice, but I will give you some steps there. We're probably only going to get up to 5, but also modeling and encouraging positive communication and modeling and encouraging well-being as well. Okay, step 1. Okay, you need to educate yourself and your team about trauma. So you have to build a culture which is learning, reflecting, and understanding. And the best way to start with anything, as always, of course, I'm a teacher, so I'm going to say this, it's always through education. Education is always going to be the key to anything. No one can take what you've learned away from you, ever. That's why education is so important. So first of all, we need to understand what trauma is. So trauma is defined as a traumatic experience which was overwhelming, it was threatening, it was frightening, and it was out of our control. There are lots of different types of traumas, but anything that a person finds traumatic, or anything that happens, an incident that occurs that makes them feel like they're out of control, that's when the trauma occurs. And usually the bit where they're feeling out of control and scared for their life or for someone else's life is usually the point. That's the pointy end. So there's lots of things that can cause trauma. You could have a one-off or an ongoing event. You could live in a traumatic atmosphere, being directly harmed through emotional, physical, or sexual violence, witnessing harm to someone else, being affected by trauma in family and community. This is also a very big one for people who have come from war-torn countries. We've got a lot of if people have come as refugees, there's a lot of experience here, and First Nations people are the other ones that can experience trauma in family and community. And your experience of trauma can relate to different parts of your identity, things that have happened to you over your life, things that have formed a big part of who you are. Trauma is a very personal experience, and I know the word gets thrown around a lot, but I think people are underestimating the impact that this has on people. So we're going to delve into this a little bit more. And the reason why it's important, 75% of Australian adults have experienced at least one traumatic event at some point in their life. International studies are saying that 62 to 68% of young people will have been exposed to a traumatic event at least once by the time they're 17. This stat is really important, the one in yellow, and this is where I'm really working to raise awareness, is that 30%, it's estimated that 30% of Australian youth have experienced multiple adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. So they're often called ACEs, if you've heard of the term ACEs before, adverse child experiences. And adverse child experiences, if you've got multiple adverse child experiences, they will often result in complex trauma. And that is a really tricky trauma that's coming through, especially with younger people coming into the workforce. If you're working with young people, if you're working with trainees, if you're working with apprenticeship people on apprenticeships, complex trauma is something that you need a lot of understanding on if you're working with young people. And complex trauma doesn't just disappear because you turned, 25. It does carry through, and it's really important to understand that link and the importance of that, and how this really, honestly, it really affects people. And trauma-informed leadership is needed because half to 2/3 of our population has had at least one overwhelming experience of trauma, and people have suffered at the hands of other people's leadership. In people's experience, most people are going to be probably able to tell you at least once or twice or 3 times or a dozen times when someone has used leadership to abuse power and control. And some people lead really well and they're very ethical and they try their best, and some people use leadership or the opportunity of being in a position of leadership to misuse power and control. It happens, and most people have experienced that once, twice, if not multiple times. So types of trauma, there's acute trauma, which is related to an event that is time limited or it's one-off. So it could be like, for example, someone could have gotten into a car accident, and they found that as a traumatic event. Could be a natural disaster. So people who've been in fires or floods. Chronic is when it's repeated or it's prolonged exposure. So torture, abuse, war, domestic violence, repeated sexual assault, all of those things are chronic trauma because they're happening again and again and again and again and again and again. Historical trauma is what we look at as sort of historical intergenerational trauma. It's passed down through generations. And how that happens is someone may have, so if you've got a group in society that has experienced traumatic events and they haven't been able to heal from those events, the impact it has on their mental health and well-being is then carried down often to their children. That's then carried down to their children's children. That's carried down to their children's children's children. It really does repeat. And I have seen this happen with so many people that I've come into contact with, often people who are from traumatic backgrounds, especially if it's complex trauma. There was historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. Their grandparents were, their grandparents grew up that way. Their parents grew up that way. They grew up that way. It really does follow. And it's not that people want to repeat mistakes. It's that that's all they've got to model from. And that's important that we build education around that, because education, again, is the only way out of that intergenerational cycle and that link, which is, and again, very, very hard to break, but education's your first port of call. And complex trauma, this is often result when you're a child and adolescent and you experience trauma. It's often, it could be repeated abuse or witnessing abuse, domestic violence, neglect, parentification, where you've been put in the position of being, of looking after certain members of the household when you were a child, when it wasn't really your job, but you've been pushed into that role. Complex bullying at school, like if you've had severe bullying at school, if you had lots of really adverse experiences through education, all of those things add to complex trauma. And this was just a bit more an intergenerational trauma, especially due for First Nations people. And I also think we're going to see a lot more of this with, Australia's got a lot of people who have come from who are refugees who've come from war-torn countries. I work with a huge number of students who've come from Afghanistan and Syria, and there is a lot of trauma associated with their experiences that they had there, because they witnessed war and being oppressed and being frightened all the time. All of those things definitely have an impact. The other thing I do want to highlight, which doesn't always get enough screen time, is trauma and neurodivergence. So people who are neurodivergent, so people who've struggled with things like autism, being ASD on the spectrum, people who've struggled with ADD or ADHD, and people who struggle with dyslexia as well, will sometimes find that they've had a number of experiences when they were younger which were negative. And sometimes there's a lot of trauma associated with that. At times, kids were bullied or isolated, and they've taken that with them. And when they see glimmers of that occurring again in the workplace, that can really take them back to quite a traumatic place. And that probably doesn't get enough airtime, So there's a couple of things to bring up as well. People who are diagnosed with autism, depending on where they are in the spectrum, but they might have difficulty communicating. That can be misinterpreted as them being difficult. They can be very rigid with their routines because that's their way of surviving, and they put those routines and these rigid ideas in place because that's their coping mechanism with the whole world that isn't made for them, being neurodivergent. And how that comes across to people in the workplace, it's understanding, it's gaining a bit of empathy for what that looks like for people. There's also some really horrifying statistics around sexual assault for people on the spectrum, which is really awful. And sexual assault brings with it a huge amount of trauma as well. So that's something that is also important to consider. people who've had ADD, ADHD, and dyslexia, if they were not well supported through school, or if they're, and you know, it's not always just school. It could be if they weren't diagnosed, because let's face it, the getting diagnoses for these things costs, you know, thousands of dollars. Not all parents have the money to do it. Some people have had to struggle with those neurodivergent issues their whole life. And they have negative memories of having to speak out loud or read out loud in front of people. They don't like being put on the spot. They feel stupid, and they will have real great reactions to that happening as adults. So you often will need to make adjustments for people who are neurodivergent. You could have someone who's dyslexic. If you ask them to read aloud, that can be really difficult because the letters or numbers, depending, will jump around on the page for them. They might need a moment to gather themselves. It's always best not to ask people like that to read out loud. You're not always going to know if someone's dyslexic. Sometimes people will tell you, but they will tell you if you've built that trust. And, you know, if you've got someone who's on the spectrum and you've put everybody, you know, they're used to working in an office with one person, and you suddenly put them in an open plan floor plan with, you know, 200 other people because you're doing a work event, expect them to maybe not handle that well, because there's massive sensory overload, big groups, it's disruption, it's a huge amount of social anxiety for that person. It's really important to remember that these people aren't being difficult. Their life and the coping mechanisms that they have constructed exist so that they can survive in a world that is really built for neurotypical people. This is a stat that's really horrifying about autism and sexual assault. 9 out of 10 autistic women have been sexually assaulted, and that's 3 to 4 times higher than neurotypical women. And we know that sexual assault is a massive issue in Australia. It's a huge issue with people who suffer from disabilities, or people with autism. So it's really important to understand that. Also, trauma and marginalisation. So if you've got groups in your workplace who are used to being marginalised, they will be really, really, they're aware that they're the person that's different from the group. They're used to being the different person. They're used to being isolated. They will be very, very aware and hyper vigilant around things like racism, bullying. They may feel like they don't have, you know, they don't have the confidence to hold space in a big room. You really will have to, if you're trying to collaborate with people who are used to being marginalized, you need to build that trust, and you need to really encourage them to be able to speak and put their thoughts forward, because they've spent a lifetime learning to blend in, or a lifetime being told that they're the other and to shut up and to be quiet. So it's really important to understand that there's a lot of deep set trauma if they're from marginalized groups. So giving them, as a leader, giving them that opportunity to be heard, encouraging them to speak up, being really alert to bullying, to racism, to any racist jokes or people's sort of stereotypical ideas. Address them quickly. If you hear them, if you hear of them, you need to jump on those things so fast. Don't just let that stuff go, because it may, you know, these can just be small things that people don't necessarily see as a big deal, but for someone who's spent their whole life being marginalized, there can be a huge amount of trauma attached to that. And it's something that we do need to be really sensitive about. And people bullying is the other thing. Bullying at work, which is a massive hot topic at the moment, but people who've experienced bullying in the workplace, really it makes a massive impact on people's mental health. People who've been bullied in the workplace may have also been bullied as children, as adolescents, and they might really have quite traumatic memories of that. People who are experiencing bullying in the workplace are much more likely to develop depression, anxiety, experience suicidal thoughts. And it's important that you create that no bullying workplace culture. Take any complaints about bullying seriously. You know, it's nothing to do with someone being soft or too sensitive. If someone has worked up the courage to tell you that they're being given a hard time, yeah, you do need to be listening to that. Okay, and be aware of DAVO, which is I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's something that as a leader, you do need to be really aware of, the deny, attack, reverse, victim, offender order. So it's sort of like people who tend to bully are very good at throwing other people under the bus, or very good at putting the person that they've picked as their victim, they're very good at kicking, having them off balance or making them feel like they're the actual problem in the scenario. Do be aware of this. It exists often when you've got workplace bullies, because they are often very good at flying under the radar. They don't necessarily do things overtly. It's under the surface. So that's another thing to be aware of. And it's very abusive. So can cause a lot of trauma for people. The effects of trauma on people: agitation, hypervigilance, nervousness, anxiety. The big thing I noticed, so when I got diagnosed with PTSD after I had a very, very frightening work incident, the big thing I noticed was I had awful sleep disruption. So I used to have nightmares every night. So I'd wake up drenched in sweat, and then I'd sort of have to get up and go to work the next day. I used to have days where I would feel intensely anxious and everything was scary, and then days where I'd feel really, really depressed. And then the biggest thing I noticed as well was my memory. I couldn't keep anything in my head. People who are struggling with trauma will often have trouble with memory. They're not being forgetful. They're not being silly. They're not trying to be difficult. I have always had a really good memory. I couldn't keep anything in my head. That's really important to understand. The effects of trauma on people really are, they're not just psychological, they're physiological as well. And it's not uncommon to see that someone who has had trauma to then experience things like anxiety, depression, the issues that come from PTSD, but they might experience stomach upsets, headaches, muscle aches and pains. All of these things are all effects of trauma. The body keeps the score. If you've ever read that book, The Body Keeps the Score. Really important. And how trauma can look on the outside for us is that someone who has struggled with trauma might have difficulty trusting, forming secure relationships. They might have difficulty regulating emotions, and they might have a deep distrust of people that are in positions of power. So you kind of have to lead knowing that sometimes these people are going to distrust you just because you're a leader. And they may not want to believe anything that you say because you're actually in a position of power, and they so often haven't been. So they may already have a deep distrust for you, and then you've got to work to change that. Often some people who struggle with trauma might have a lot of trouble resolving conflict without it sort of escalating or becoming aggressive. And they often struggle with really, really low self-confidence, which is where they really need that empathy and that encouragement from you. Because even though they may be acting a particular way, underneath it, you've got to look at what it means. This is a big thing. I got this from a psychologist friend of mine who learned this from a therapist of hers. And she said to me, I thought this was great: if you've got a situation and it's a tennis ball situation, but the reaction's a basketball size reaction, everything else in the basketball is trauma. If that reaction doesn't match, you can bet your bottom dollar that all the other things that have come into this basketball reaction will be trauma related. Okay. So like, for example, you might have someone come in and go, oh, I'm sorry, I'm late. And you might go, oh, okay, no worries. Just try and be here and on time next time. What do you mean being on? I put so much work and I do all of this. And you're thinking, whoa, 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 whoa. Where did that reaction come from? And what you don't know is that person's struggling with home life. They're struggling with their mental health. They're struggling with, they're struggling with the relationship with their partner. They are used to being criticized all the time because in their childhood they were. So they might blow up and you might think, whoa, what did I say? And it's not you. It's that the trauma of that person has come into that situation. And sometimes you've got to step back from that reaction and understand and realize that. So the self-awareness for you as well is really important. You've got to understand your own triggers and stresses. So you need to reflect on your own experiences with trauma and it's also a really good time. If you're going to be a good leader, you need to seek support on that for you. And you need to understand what your stresses and triggers are. And you need to work on developing your own emotional intelligence, because how can you possibly do anything for anyone else if you're not looking after yourself? Which is why I always add this picture. I've got a friend that says this all the time. How can you oxygen mask on yourself first? You can't help anyone else if you're not helping yourself first. It's true. I would do this balloon activity if we were in a class, but we're not. So I'll skip that one. And this is just understanding what happens a little bit to your body when you do go through stress and trauma. And that's one of the things that comes up with the balloon activity. I would have also asked you to fill in what your signs of stress were and how you manage them. And it's always good to reflect on what your signs of stress are. Like, do you tend to get headaches? Do you get stomach upsets? Like, I get stomach upsets really quickly when I'm stressed. I get headaches. I start to have trouble sleeping. All of these things start to show up. We've all got tells. We've all got tells that tell us that perhaps, oh, I'm a bit stressed and I might not be managing it that well. We all have tells. And this is really important with trauma and responses, because trauma responses are different for people depending on their background, depending on the type of threat. So there are certain people who will always be ready to fight and engage and confront. There are people who will want to run away. That's flight. People who freeze, who will just shut down. They almost look like they're completely disassociating when they're under stress, or when they've had something, when they're under high amounts of stress, or they've had a traumatic experience, and they will shut down. And then you've got people who will fawn, and your fawning is often seen with sexual harassment or sexual assault. You often see it in females. And that response is very much like, if I'm nice to my attacker, or if I'm nice to this person and I do everything they ask and I don't make them angry, they'll stop hurting me. So fawn can often be looked at, it's misinterpreted, as people not being upset by a situation, but it's people appeasing because they're scared. And it's really important to see that. I think we can spot fight, we can spot flight, you can pretty much spot freeze as well. But fawn's quite hard to spot, and that is also a trauma response. So that's one's really important to consider, especially around females, and especially around sexual harassment and sexual assault. So a bit of a discussion, which I'd have if you're in a class, but I won't right now. What happens to your strap brain and your thinking process when you're going through massive amounts of stress or trauma? Well, basically, you get what we call the amygdala hijack, where the amygdala takes control. In high emotion or high stress, the amygdala takes control of your brain and says, right, threat, panic, we're in trouble, survive. Everything is about survival. Everything is about jumping into one of those traumatic responses, right? Do we fight? Do we freeze? Do we fly? Do we fawn? Do we do a mix of those things? What do we do? So that's what high emotion's always all about. And when you're like that, your ability to process information, to remember information, to be chronological and logical with information is gone, because your higher cortex, your prefrontal cortex, is shut down. So the thinking part of your brain goes, okay, when trauma or stress is heightening, your brain goes, okay, all right. And the amygdala goes, I've got to take over now. And it just jumps in and it goes, right, we've got to survive. So do I make sure that the blood, your heart's pumping fast, and is there blood going around the body in case you need to run away? And all right, you've got to be hyper vigilant, but get ready. There's danger, get ready, there's threat. But your thinking part of your brain can't be engaged when your amygdala is taken over. So it's really important to understand, in parts of high stress, high emotion, trauma, people's thinking brain, their prefrontal cortex does shut down. The way they store information goes, the way they can even recall information after a traumatic event. All of those things are affected because their thinking brain had to close down to let the survival brain, the amygdala, take over, right? So it's incredibly important to remember that. If you have to talk to someone about an experience where they had high stress or high emotion or there was trauma involved, you will often find that the way they recall the event or the way they can remember that information is often not chronological. It might be in pieces. It may not, they may have fixated on a detail that you think, well, that's not important. Why have you fixated on that? And it's all about how where they were at the time when their brain realized that they were in real, or where they perceived they were in real danger and real threat, because the amygdala had to take over. So their prefrontal cortex shut down. So there is a real so if you ever have to interview someone or you ever have to talk to someone after a traumatic experience, it's really important to remember that, because the way they do store that information will be very, very different. This is important. Curiosity, not judgment. We've got to shift to this thinking. Trauma-informed leadership is all about this. This is an activity I was given once in university. So I'm going to let you have a look at it for a second. See if you know what it means. I'm going to give you a minute. If you were in class, I'd make you do it as a class, but you're not. Have a look. You're all smart people. Crack the code. Anyone manage to crack it? I couldn't when I was given it. It's a knitting pattern, by the way. It's actually a knitting pattern for this particular image. When I give you this pattern and this image together, I'm letting you see the context. I've given you the backgrounds and I've given you context for the code. You now go, oh, okay, that's how you knit that particular pattern. Now, you may not be able to knit. I can't knit. But the point is that now you understand what it's used for. And trauma-informed practice is about understanding that there's a context we're not always going to understand. And we have to sometimes fill in the blanks or be curious about what those blanks are in order to get further with a person, in order to connect with that person, or to develop a relationship with that person, or to understand someone's reaction to something. So instead of thinking what's wrong with you, you want to think what may have happened. What is this behavior, or what is this actually about? Like what really has happened here? And we need to consider that. So for example, you might have someone who gets mad really, really easily. You might think, oh, this person's so difficult to deal with. They always want their own way. Oh, they're so hard to work with. And really, that person's really scared. And that person might be scared of something that you wouldn't think is terrifying, but you're going to have to find out what that is. And you might have to say to that person, look, I see, like, I get you're really angry and I'm trying to understand why, but I don't understand why. Can you please explain this to me? Can we please talk about this? Same with when you've got people who want constant validation and approval. It can be really irritating when you've got people who seem to constantly be there wanting you to give them that praise and that input and yeah, that was good. And I know that can seem irritating, but again, what's underneath this is someone whose needs were probably never met. You might have had someone who never had their needs met as a child, an adolescent who never had their needs met. And essentially you've now got an adult, or you've got someone who's of working age in your workplace who still has those same things. They probably had incredible critical people around them, and they never actually developed their own self-actualization, their own self-confidence. So you need to build that confidence with that person. You need to be saying to that person, you know what, you're doing a really great job with this. I'm really proud of you. I trust that you can do this. I want to see you have some confidence in yourself. I want to see you confident that you can do this. You know how to do this. I know you know how to do this, right? You really want to be saying those types of things to that person. It's tough because it can get irritating. Someone who doesn't want to engage or make eye contact, we can think they're disrespectful, but there's a number of things that could go on there. There could be cultural factors at play. First Nations people often do not make eye contact directly to a superior because it's seen as disrespectful. If they're in trouble as well, it's looking down. People from Asian backgrounds as well will tend to look down. I spent 6 years teaching in Japan. This drove me nuts. But then I realized over time, oh, okay, they're actually showing me respect by not looking at me in the face. They're looking down because they're trying to show me they're sorry. And often there's a lot of shame that's attached to that. And when people are ashamed and they're looking down or they're withdrawing into themselves, you can guess that how they're feeling is probably a deep shame. And you don't want to, you don't want to exasperate that. You don't want to make that person feel worse. You want to say, okay, all right, look, you made a mistake. Let's just talk this through. We all make mistakes. You want to reassure and you want to be compassionate and empathetic. People who are often quick and defensive at the slightest feedback, and they might seem really reactive and they might seem really difficult to work with. Again, a lot of this will come down to incredibly low self-confidence and a lot of fear and a massive lack of self-esteem. And, you've heard of that sandwich method, positive, negative, positive. With trauma-informed practice, it's one of the biggest lessons I learned was sandwich. You've done this really well. I love how you did this. We might need to work a bit more on this, but, this was great. And that is so important because often what you've got is underneath someone who is just a scared child who has no self-confidence, doesn't think they're good at anything. And if I'm aggressive with you and if I'm defensive with you and then you push me aside, well, it proves me right that all people in positions of power are bad and I'm no good anyway. And you've got people who are working in a cycle of, they actually get you to try and prove their trauma thought patterns because that's the only way they know how to survive. And you've got to break that. You've got to step back and break that. And that's hard. That's really hard, especially if someone's giving you a hard time. Neurodivergent considerations, obviously, if you've got people who don't want to make eye contact, have you considered if they're on the spectrum? Have you considered if they've got ADHD and they're distracted by other things in the room? Someone who may not answer questions out loud or becomes nervous in large crowds or doesn't like to socialize with co-workers. All of these things can be triggers for people who are on the spectrum or other neurodivergent considerations. It can cause intense social anxiety for people. So just remembering that if you're noticing someone be like kind of nervous or socially anxious, maybe just if they're in a crowd, like maybe, walking up to them going, yeah, you okay? And that person might be like, oh, I hate big crowded spaces. Like, oh, you're doing really well. Or what did you think of the food that we had? Or you're trying to make that person feel a bit more comfortable, but also remembering that if they're in that environment, they may be completely sensory overloaded and really triggered. Okay, here are some triggers. I'm not going to go into this too much, but it's really important to educate yourself and your team on triggers of stress and looking at things like mental health management. There are so many things that can trigger people. Sounds, people, thoughts, smells. We used to have this kid who would get so angry after recess and he would get so escalated and he'd be okay before recess. He'd go and run around recess and he'd come back in after to, sit down and do his sort of second session of work. And he just used to fly off the wall and get angry and throw chairs. They figured out eventually that it was the smell of coffee. So the teacher or the EA would drink coffee at recess, and one of his biggest triggers was the smell of coffee on someone's breath. So you don't know what people's triggers are and what that connects to. And you don't need to know, but you need to sort of see what people's triggers are and think of what your own triggers are. We've all got them, right? We've all got triggers. This is something that is being trialed in a couple of different workplaces, and it's apparently been quite successful. These are little emotion cards. I don't know if you can see because I'm probably small while I'm presenting to you, but they're emotion cards. This is green for you're feeling okay, blue for feeling maybe a bit worried or maybe a bit tired or a bit headachy, or you're not feeling yourself today. Amber, I'm getting nervous. I'm nervous, or I'm anxious, or I'm worried, or I'm becoming escalated. And then red is for like, nah, angry, in the red zone, not a good time to talk. There are some workplaces that are now using this or a traffic light system, and they're actually having it stuck on computers or desks. And that's actually showing people within the organization, like what mood are people in? It seems like, I know it might seem kind of childish, but it's actually such a clever way of showing people, you know, without drawing attention to yourself, but showing people where you're at. Like if someone's on red, probably not a good time to talk to them, but you know they're on red and you can be gentle with your interactions. It's so simple. It's so simple. And I think this is actually, it's apparently being really, really effective in places that are using it. Other places are just using the traffic light system, the green, amber, and red. But people just have it on their desk or on their computer, just like blue tacked on, or like the little, they've got like little toy traffic lights. And those lights are telling people where their mood is for that day, which is just something to consider. Triggers for those that are neurodivergent. I've talked a little bit about this, so I won't go into this too much, but just remember sensory overload for people. Some people are really sensory avoidant, and, you know, being put in situations where there is lots of light or noise or music or heaps of people, that can be really uncomfortable for people who are neurodivergent. Same as academic, if you've got people who really avoid writing or reading, or they're just terrified of doing any written work, they don't want to write emails, they don't want to do anything, you know, asking that person to do a presentation is just like a massive overload for that person. So just be aware that often when people try to avoid those tasks, there is trauma attached to that. Or there might be neurodivergent considerations that you need to think of. Assisting people who are neurodivergent, obviously not putting them on the spot, not getting them to read in front of people. If you're asking a team for feedback, for example, if you give people a chance to think, pair, share before they actually, you know, before they actually answer a question, you're creating a safe environment. You're letting people rehearse their answers first. And that's something that is a really important tip for people. It's, you know, giving people the chance where they don't feel like they're going to be put on the spot and they don't want to feel stupid. Some people have got real worries about feeling stupid. So let them rehearse, let them talk about it amongst themselves first. Don't get people to share on the spot. If there's going to be a disruption to a work routine, get team members to, you know, if you've got neurodivergent team members that you know are neurodivergent, maybe giving them the heads up on that might be important. Sensory considerations, do they need noise cancelling headphones? Are they going to be alarmed by flashing lights? Like all of those things. You need to consider those things when you're leading. Okay, step 5. Step 4, sorry, not step 5. I'm aware I'm running out of time. Educate yourself and your team on stress and mental health symptoms. So people, if they're feeling anxious, withdrawn, if they've got trouble sleeping, stomach upsets, headache, all of these things are signs often of poor mental health and trauma. And if someone is experiencing these types of symptoms, this is where you also need to be able to have that conversation with a team member and be able to go, okay, in a non-judgmental way, following mental health first aid structure, you know, I care about you, I'm worried about you, I can see that you're not, I noticed that you're coming in late. You've been in late a few times this week. I'm wondering, is everything okay? You know, you look like you're not sleeping. You've said you've had a lot of headaches. You know, is everything okay? You know, and trying to get that person to open up to you. And having those mental health conversations is incredibly important because all of these things generally they're always underlying something else. Okay. I don't think people are ever like this for no reason. You might have an off day, but if you've got people who are having a longer period of time where you're seeing this, that's where I do recommend mental health first aid training for any leaders and also mental health first aid training within your team. It is so important for people to be able to recognize symptoms and to learn how to have the conversation, because most people are terrified of having a mental health conversation. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to do the wrong thing, but saying nothing isn't helpful either. So we want to give people the tools, right? This is all about people picking up the tools so that they can do it themselves. All right. This was also an interesting thing that I saw the other day, is that 71% of employees would feel worried telling their employer about a mental health condition. So you need to be that leader that people are comfortable with, so that they can go to you and go, okay, look, I'm not sleeping, I can't eat, I feel terrible, I don't know what's wrong with me, so that you can have that conversation. You can encourage that person to seek professional help. They're not going to come to you if they don't trust you and they don't feel safe with you. So that's what this is. You're building all of these blocks so that you can even have that conversation. And also, is your workplace set up for, encouraging people on where to go for mental health support? Do they know what the signs of stress are? Have they, have you got a poster up in, you don't have to have them right in the middle of the office floor, but, have you got things on the back of toilet doors? Have you got things just, over the photocopier? Have you got things where people might go to make a cup of coffee, where people kind of have to linger naturally? Have you got posters there where people are like, these are your support services, speak out if you feel like this, if you do things like that, you're showing people in a real visual way that, yes, you care about this stuff, and you're not trying to put people on the spot. You don't want to make people feel shy or nervous about it, but you're trying to show people that, yes, you can, these are the things, these are the places that you can go. Yes, we're a workplace that recognizes this. Yes, we support your need for having good mental health and well-being. And this is important as well, empathetic communication during escalation and crisis. So this is important. If you're in a situation that is escalating, you need to be able to first check in with yourself. Consider where you're at. Is your coffee cup full that day, or is it empty that day? Okay, so when you come in and someone's in and there's a conflict and you're trying to mediate this conflict, or you're trying to de-escalate the situation, where are you at? Okay, are you empty? Are you full? So be aware of that, because it's important we do a check-in with ourselves as well, because other people's aggression and other people's emotions can certainly be triggering for us. Take a deep breath. We forget that. I forget that all the time. My students at school remind me consistently, take a deep breath, miss, take a deep breath. I forget. Right? It will help you. Okay. You need to be able to do these things. You need to understand what your triggers are, right? In a crisis, the whole point is making your way through the crisis, all the conflicts, and you're trying to maintain the relationship or repair the relationship afterwards. So you need to be aware of what your own self-regulation skills are too, right? So if someone gets up in your face and they're aggressive, what do you do to try and keep yourself here while they've gone here? What are you doing? Because you can't, if someone's up here, you can't meet that person up there. You've got to stay here to bring them down, to lower the crisis, right? That can be hard, because if someone's approaching you and they're being aggressive and they're being confrontational, this is really hard, okay? Because you've got, this is tricky. So understand what your own triggers are, and how do you keep yourself calm? Do you have to take a deep breath? Do you, like I found that I used to, when I dealt with lots of crisis situations, I used to take a deep breath and I'd clench my stomach and I'd be like, yep, you got this. And inside my head, yep, you got this, you got this, you got this, Tanya, you're all good, you got this. And I used to have to tell myself that before I actually dealt with the situation of crisis. What do you do? What's your self-regulation? And I'd step back and I'd remember, this person's up here, I have to stay here. Okay. This is so important to understand, that meanings in crisis. So when you'll see, this is from the actual School of Special Education Needs and Behaviour. This is who are some of the best people at understanding how to deal with crisis prevention and co-regulation. People who are struggling with mental health and people who are struggling from trauma will struggle to emotionally regulate, because their cup is already full. Their amygdala is already firing off over basic life, basic living, and they are already up here. So the slightest thing can send them off the edge. Don't take that personally. But the difficulty is that when people are in the red zone or they're in crisis, they won't hear what you've got to say. So you've got to make sure that you watch your facial expressions, you watch your tone of voice, and you watch your words, but only 7% is words. People aren't really going to hear you when they're in that red zone. So remember that, because it's obviously we want to reason with someone, but you can't. So this is what you do have to do. You have to look at your nonverbal cues. So are you nodding at that person? I worked, like I said, worked with a lot of kids with complex trauma who were who could be incredibly violent and aggressive. So I would sit down. If you can get someone to sit down when they're tense, that's the best thing you can do. Have you ever tried to stay tense and sit down? Like, you could try doing it now. Try standing up and tensing all your muscles and then try staying that way when you sit down. It's like impossible. You can't tense everything and still sit down. So encouraging people to sit down, nodding with the person, having your palms. I would always make sure my palms were visible. I would always make sure my body language was really open. I would keep my shoulders down. I would, I would stand in a really non-threatening way. I would actually stand off to the side to make myself look smaller when someone was really aggravated, because these are the things that we do. When a person can't hear what you're saying, they can only look at what you're doing. And the other thing is you may find that you even have to exaggerate facial expressions. You might have to exaggerate your body language. You have to actually do all of those things because people are so agitated, they can't hear you. So it's like you're nodding and you're going, yep, okay, yep, all right, go on, yep, okay, I see, yep, I understand, yep, okay, okay. You're, leaning towards that person, you keep your face. Don't like, not blank, but you're listening. Yep, okay, okay. Open body position. Don't cross your arms. Don't turn away from that person. Do make sure that you're really trying. And it feels unnatural sometimes to open yourself out like that, especially when someone's being aggressive. It can feel unnatural to do that because you kind of almost want to protect yourself too. But you actually need to show that you're not there to engage. You don't want to be aggressive. You want to bring that person down. Empathetic communication, validate. Often all people need to hear is you go, I can see you're really upset. Can you please tell me what's going on? I can hear you're upset. I can hear that you're angry. I'd like to help you. I can see this is really difficult for you right now. I'd like to help you. Can you tell me how I can help you? What can I do for you? Yes, I understand this would be very frustrating. Yep, I understand this is really difficult. Yep, I understand that must have been really scary. You don't have to say, I understand exactly what you're going through. It's not like that. You're saying, yep, I can see this is really upsetting for you. I can understand why that would be scary. You don't have to go, oh yeah, I've been there. I know exactly what you're talking about, but you're validating how someone feels. And sometimes that's all people need. And it seems really simple, but we forget to do it sometimes. And you will often see when you validate someone, you will visually see someone often go from here and they've come down and they're coming down. And then you're able to have a proper discussion with that person. But if they're in crisis, you've got to wait until they're de-escalating before you can get there. Using open-ended questions. Can you tell me what happened? What happened next? Okay, can you tell me what you remember? Again, if it's an event where that person's been really, really stressed or really upset, they're not always going to remember what's happened in a chronological order. So you need to get people to tell you what they remember. I'd obviously do more in-depth work on crisis, but it's a bit difficult because I'm running out of time. Reflective listening is always important. It sounds like this. Oh, I hear you saying this. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but are you feeling this? Oh, okay, so you're upset because of this. Is that right? Do I have that right? And you're showing people that you're really, really trying to listen to them, that you understand that person. You're not interrupting them. You're not talking over that person, which is sort of on this slide. You're not trying to give advice. You're not trying to solve the person. You're trying to reflective listen. You're letting that person have their say about what's happened. I would normally do this time for question and answers, which I can't do because I'm recording it and giving you guys the link. If you guys don't mind, I would really love it if you guys could fill out a feedback form for me. If that I'm going to email to you, I would really appreciate that. I'm sorry that you guys couldn't actually make it to the lunch and learn, but I hope that this session has helped you guys understand a little bit more about trauma-informed leadership. Obviously, there's a lot more to all of this, and I'm doing it quickly. I'm giving you sort of like a quick taste. But yes, please feel free to contact me if you'd like any more information or if there's anything that you do want to chat about further. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I haven't bored you, because it feels weird doing it without like actual interaction from people. But there we go. Thanks for listening. Stay in touch. Thanks, guys. Bye.